When I look back now, I realize how complete my life felt back then. Not perfect, but settled, balanced, good in the quiet ways that matter. I was in my late 20s, engaged to a man I loved deeply, and working a job I had prayed for more than once. I had stability, purpose, and people I trusted. My faith wasn't something I posted about or performed. It was just part of me, like breathing. Sundays were sacred. I went to church regularly, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to be there. I liked sitting in the same section, singing the same songs, and leaving with a sense that God was steady, near, and pleased with my obedience. Life felt ordered. At work, things were going well too. I had earned respect. I wasn't at the top, but I wasn't invisible either. I had a voice, and people listened. When leadership began talking about a possible corporate merger, it didn't scare me. It sounded like growth, opportunity, maybe even advancement down the road. One of the men involved in the merger discussions worked in a department above mine. He was well liked, friendly, confident, always smiling. Everyone always trusted him. I did too. He was married to my best friend. That detail mattered. It made everything feel safe. She and I had grown close over the years. We prayed together, talked about marriage, faith, and how to follow God in a world that rarely slowed down. I trusted her completely, and by extension, I trusted her husband. Nothing felt hidden then. Nothing felt tense. Even my engagement felt wrapped in peace. My fiancé supported my faith. He admired my commitment to church, my discipline, my sense of right and wrong. We talked openly about our future, about family, about building a life that honored God. I remember thanking God for that season. I didn't ask for more. I didn't ask for signs. I didn't ask for clarity, because nothing felt unclear. If you had asked me then what I feared, I wouldn't have had an answer. I believed obedience would always be simple, that doing the right thing would always be obvious. I didn't yet know that faith is often tested, not in chaos, but in comfort. Looking back, I see now. That was the chapter before everything changed. The chapter where life was gentle, and I had no idea it was preparing me for a courage I hadn't yet needed to find. I can't pinpoint the exact moment things shifted. That's what makes it unsettling when I think about it now. There was no single conversation, no dramatic announcement that made me sit up and think, something is wrong. It was more like the air in the room changed, and I didn't notice until I found myself breathing differently. The merger became official a few weeks after those early conversations. Emails started circulating. Meetings were scheduled with people I hadn't worked with before. Names I didn't recognize began appearing on shared documents. And then there was my best friend's husband. At first, his friendliness didn't stand out. It never had before. He joked easily, complimented freely, always seemed to know just what to say to put people at ease. That was part of why leadership trusted him. But something shifted once the merger discussions intensified. He lingered longer after meetings, asked questions that felt unnecessary, commented on things that had nothing to do with work. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, this was my best friend's husband, a man of position, a man of faith, or at least someone who knew how to speak that language. I didn't want to assign motives where there were none. Still, I felt it. I noticed how often he mentioned people from other company, always casually, always vaguely, how he laughed off serious questions, how his tone changed when no one else was around. The unease followed me home some evenings. I'd replay conversations while washing dishes or folding laundry, trying to convince myself there was nothing there. But the feeling stayed. One afternoon he stopped by my desk unannounced. His voice dropped, friendly but firm. He asked what I thought about the merger. I answered honestly, carefully. I spoke about diligence, transparency, doing things the right way. words I had spoken many times before. That's when his expression changed, just slightly. He smiled, but his eyes didn't. He told me things were more complicated than I realized, that people higher up had expectations, that loyalty mattered, that timing mattered. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned my fiancé, his family, their reputation. It wasn't a threat yet. It was something worse, a suggestion. I remember the way my stomach dropped, the way my heart started racing while my face stayed calm. I nodded, said very little, and watched him walk away as if nothing had happened. That night, I didn't sleep well. I didn't have proof of anything yet, just instinct, discernment. That quiet knowing I had learned not to ignore. I prayed, but not with urgency. Not yet. I still believed things would settle on their own, that good intentions would prevail, that truth would surface without cost. Looking back, I realized that was the moment God began calling me to courage, not with danger, but with a choice forming quietly in the shadows. By the time he spoke to me again, I already knew the conversation wouldn't end the way the last one had. The meetings had grown more frequent, smaller, quieter, fewer people invited. I noticed some names stopped appearing on emails, and which ones suddenly mattered more than others. The atmosphere at work had shifted from collaboration to calculation. He asked me to meet him near the conference rooms. Neutral ground, he said. Professional. He didn't waste time this time. He told me plainly that the merger wasn't as clean as leadership believed, that people from the other company were pushing boundaries, fishing for information. He said it like a warning, like he was protecting us all. Then he leaned closer. He told me my role gave me access others didn't have, that I saw things early, that I was trusted. And then came the part that made my chest tighten. He said some things were better left undocumented, that conversations didn't always need to be repeated, that discretion was what separated those who advanced from those who stayed where they were. I remember the exact words he used. You don't want to be on the wrong side of this. He talked about my future, about upcoming promotions, about how a good word from him would make a real difference once the merger was finalized. Then, almost casually, he reminded me again of my fiancé, his family's standing in the community, their reputation, their influence. This time, it was a threat. Not loud, not angry, just deliberate. If I stayed quiet, if I didn't ask questions, didn't flag concerns, didn't speak up, things would go smoothly for me, for us. But if I didn't, he let the sentence hang. I remember how still I sat after he left, how the noise of the office faded into the background, how heavy the silence felt. I wasn't being asked to do something wrong directly. I was being asked to do something worse. Nothing. To see what was happening and say nothing. To protect myself. To protect my future. To protect the people I loved. By staying silent. That night, I cried in my car before I drove home. Not because I was afraid of losing my job, but because I knew obedience was about to cost me something. I realized then that faith isn't tested when the right choice is safe. It's tested when silence is rewarded, and speaking the truth feels dangerous. I didn't go to church that night looking for answers. I went because I didn't know where else to go. The weight of the week sat heavy on my chest as I slipped into the pew. The lights were low. The music was soft at first, familiar, comforting. I sang along without thinking, but my mind kept replaying his words. You don't want to be on the wrong side of this. I tried to pray in my seat, tried to hand it all to God quietly, the way I usually did. But the more I tried to stay composed, the more I felt like something inside me was unraveling. When the pastor called for prayer at the altar, I hesitated. I wasn't someone who went forward often. I believed in prayer deeply, but I also liked control, liked order, liked knowing how things would turn out. That night, I had no idea. My feet moved before my courage caught up. I stood with others at the front, head bowed, hands open, tears pressing at the corners of my eyes. When the prayer leader asked what we were seeking, I spoke softly, almost afraid to hear my own words out loud. I asked for wisdom, for discernment, for courage I didn't yet feel. And then I asked for something else, a sign. I remember the story of Joshua, the fleece, how God met him in his uncertainty. I didn't demand anything extravagant. I didn't ask for thunder or clarity written in the sky. I asked for something simple, something unmistakable to me. I told God that if He wanted me to move forward, to speak, to confront, to risk everything, I needed reassurance that I wasn't imagining the danger, that this wasn't fear or pride or overthinking. I asked that my best friend would stop by my office unexpectedly the next day, not for a reason, not for work, just to say hello. And if she came with an extra cup of coffee, something she did often casually, I would take it as a confirmation that God was with me, guiding me, seeing what I couldn't yet explain. As soon as I prayed it, I almost regretted it. What if nothing happened? What if I stood up for something that cost me everything and discovered I had been wrong? The music shifted then, grew louder, fuller, the kind of worship that fills the room and makes it hard to stay guarded. Voices rose, hands lifted. The air felt heavy, not with emotion, but with presence. I felt God there, not rushing me, not pressuring me, but steady, close. I didn't hear instructions. I didn't get answers, but I felt something settle in my spirit, like I wasn't alone in the waiting. I went back to my seat, calmer than when I had left it, still uncertain, still afraid, but anchored. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't then. That night wasn't about the sign. It was about surrender. The next morning, I went to work trying not to think about the prayer I had prayed. I told myself not to watch the clock, not to read meaning into every hallway conversation, not to expect anything at all. I reminded myself that God didn't know me signs and that faith wasn't built on conditions. Still, I noticed everything. By mid-morning, nothing had happened. Meetings came and went. Emails filled my inbox. I focused on my task, telling myself that obedience didn't need confirmation, that I would be willing to do the right thing even without reassurance. And then, just after lunch, I heard her laugh. I recognized it instantly. I looked up from my desk and saw her standing near the entrance of my department, holding 2 cups of coffee. She wasn't dressed for work. She hadn't texted. She hadn't called. She was just there. She smiled when she saw me, like this was the most ordinary thing in the world. I was in the area, she said. Thought I'd stop by and say hi. She held out one of the cups. Extra coffee. I know you. My hand shook when I took it. We talked briefly, about nothing important. Weekend plans, church, life. She didn't stay long. She didn't ask questions. She didn't sense the weight sitting behind my eyes. And yet, in that small, unplanned moment, something in me settled. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel relieved. I felt seen. I went back to my desk with the coffee untouched, heart racing, not from excitement, but from clarity. God hadn't shouted. He hadn't spelled anything out, but He had answered. That afternoon I stopped avoiding the truth. I began replaying every interaction I'd brushed aside, every uncomfortable comment, every moment I had explained away out of loyalty or fear of disrupting peace. I asked God for something else then, not a sign, but understanding. I needed to know why. Why someone I trusted would risk everything. Why charm had turned into manipulation. Why silence was being purchased with threats instead of trust. That night, I prayed differently. I asked God for wisdom that protected people, not just reputations, for discernment that didn't accuse, but didn't ignore, for words that could confront without destroying. I didn't yet know how or when I would speak, but I knew I would, because the peace I felt didn't come from avoiding the storm. It came from knowing God was already in it. I hadn't said anything yet. That's the part that still amazes me. I hadn't confronted him, hadn't reported anything, hadn't warned anyone. All I had done was pray and choose not to agree to silence. Apparently, that was enough. It started with a phone call I didn't expect. My fiancé sounded uneasy, careful, like he was choosing his words one at a time. He asked me if everything was okay at work. I remember pausing, trying to understand the question before answering it. I told him, yes, busy, but fine. I asked why. He hesitated. Then he told me his parents had heard something concerning. Later that evening, I learned how it had unfolded. They had been out to dinner at a familiar restaurant, a quiet place, somewhere comfortable, and while they were eating, a voice nearby had grown louder than necessary, too loud to be accidental. It was him, my best friend's husband. He was talking about trust issues in the workplace, about people who couldn't be relied on, about how dangerous it was when someone didn't understand confidentiality. He never said my name. He didn't have to. He spoke just clearly enough, just long enough, with just enough concern in his voice to make it sound like he was warning others rather than attacking. By the time my future in-laws realized who he was talking about, the damage had already been done. They didn't confront him. They didn't ask questions. They went straight to their son. That night, my fiancé sat across from me, his expression a mix of confusion and worry. He told me what he'd heard. He asked me, gently, if there was something I needed to explain. I took a breath, and then I told him everything. I told him about the merger, about the meetings, about the threats disguised as favors, about the pressure to stay silent. Then I told him about church, about the altar, about the prayer I prayed when I didn't know what else to do. I didn't rush. I didn't defend myself loudly. I didn't accuse. I just told the truth. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then he reached for my hand. He told me he believed me, and in that moment I realized something important. The test hadn't just been about courage at work. It had been about trust at home. That night, instead of pulling away, we prayed together. Not for revenge, not for vindication, but for wisdom, for the battle we could feel approaching. Because once someone decides to rewrite the story about you, staying quiet is no longer an option. And obedience, I was learning, doesn't always protect you from pain. Sometimes it simply prepares you to stand when the storm arrives. That night changed something between us. After the prayers, after the tears, after the long silence where neither of us rushed to fill the space, my fiancé looked at me and said something I will never forget. We don't fight this with fear. He didn't say it angrily. He didn't say it like a challenge. He said it like a decision that had already settled in his spirit. That's when I realized I wasn't meant to carry this alone. We talked late into the night, not about revenge or how to protect ourselves, but about what obedience would look like if we did it right, if we did it God's way. I told him I believed the truth needed to come out, but carefully, with wisdom, without accusation. I didn't want to destroy anyone. I wanted exposure that led to correction, not chaos. The hardest part wasn't thinking about my job. It was thinking about my best friend. I loved her. She had prayed with me, celebrated my engagement, walked with me through seasons of joy and doubt. The thought of being the one to bring pain into her life felt unbearable. But silence wouldn't protect her. It would only delay the truth. We prayed again, this time for courage to speak with love, and for God to prepare hearts before words were ever spoken. The next day, I asked her to meet me. I didn't choose a dramatic setting, just a quiet place, somewhere familiar, safe. I remember how hard it was to keep my voice steady as I told her there was something important I needed to share. I told her slowly. I shared only what I knew, only what I had experienced. No assumptions, no exaggerations. I watched her face as realization settled in. She didn't cry at first. She grew quiet. And then she asked questions I couldn't answer. That was when I understood. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about truth having room to breathe. She told me something then that surprised me. She said she had sensed something was off for months, small inconsistencies, defensiveness she hadn't been able to explain, moments she had brushed aside because it felt easier to trust than to confront. We sat there in silence, the weight of everything between us. Before we parted, we prayed, not for outcomes, not for exposure, but for wisdom, protection, and courage to walk through whatever was coming next. Later that week, things moved faster than I expected. She told me something she hadn't shared before. Her uncle was the CEO, and suddenly the story wasn't just personal anymore. It was about integrity and leadership, and the kind of truth that doesn't stay hidden forever. I went home that night aware of something new. The moment for courage had arrived, and God had already gone ahead of us. The day of the meeting arrived sooner than I expected. It was supposed to be routine, final approvals, polished presentations, a formality before the merger became official. Most people walked in that morning smiling, already imagining what came next. I walked in praying, not out loud, not dramatically, just quietly, asking God to help me speak with wisdom if I was asked, and to keep me silent if I wasn't. My best friend sat a few seats away from me. I learned later it was a favor granted by her uncle. She didn't look at her husband. He didn't look at her either. The room filled quickly. Executives from both companies, legal counsel, department heads, and then her uncle entered, the CEO, calm, unhurried, observant. When the meeting began, nothing felt unusual at first. Slides advanced, numbers were discussed. The merger was framed as a success already underway. Then the CEO paused. He said there were concerns that needed to be addressed before anything moved forward. The air shifted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone by name. He spoke about integrity, about trust between companies, about the responsibility leadership carries when others follow. Then he asked for documentation. What happened next still feels surreal when I think about it. Evidence appeared not from me, but from multiple sources, emails, access logs, recorded conversations captured through proper company channels, patterns that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. The room grew quiet as the weight of it all settled in. Questions were asked, answers faltered, and then the CEO named him. He didn't argue. He didn't charm his way out. For the first time since I had known him, he looked small. The decision was swift. He was terminated, effective immediately. Security escorted him out. No applause followed. No satisfaction rose in me. Only a heavy stillness and a strange sense of peace. The merger was halted. Investigations were announced. Legal teams took over. And just like that, the pressure that had once felt crushing lifted. Later that day, the CEO called me into his office. He thanked me, not for accusing, but for remaining steady, for choosing integrity even when it would have been easier to protect myself. He told me something I didn't expect. He said leadership isn't proven in moments of comfort, but in moments where truth costs something. A race followed, not immediately, but eventually, and more responsibility, the kind that built on trust, not silence. As I left the building that evening, I realized something important. God hadn't needed me to fight. He had only needed me to stand. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public apologies, just the slow unfolding of consequences, each one landing exactly where it belonged. My best friend didn't call for a while. I understood. When she finally did, her voice sounded tired in a way I had never heard before. Not angry, not bitter, just worn down by truth she hadn't asked to carry. She told me they were separating, at least for now, not as punishment, but as protection. Counseling was scheduled. A minister they trusted had agreed to walk with them through what would likely be a long process. She said something that stayed with me. I needed the truth, even if it hurt. The other company moved forward with their own investigation. Allegations were filed. Lawyers stepped in. Everything that had been hidden began to surface in ways none of us could control anymore. And strangely, that brought peace. not relief, not celebration. Peace. At work, things changed too. I was given more responsibility, not as a reward, but as recognition. Leadership began to include me in conversations that once felt distant. I didn't seek the influence, but I didn't shrink from it either. My fiance stood beside me through all of it. We talked more openly than we ever had, prayed more honestly, built trust that wasn't based on comfort, but on conviction. That season shaped us. Even when I look back now, I don't remember fear as clearly as I remember God's steadiness. I learned that obedience doesn't always end with everything neatly restored. Sometimes it ends with scars, altered relationships, and a deeper understanding of grace. But it also leaves behind something stronger than comfort. It leaves courage and faith that no longer depends on circumstances. I didn't lose my job. I didn't lose my future. And I didn't lose my faith. I found it. And if I had to walk that road again, even knowing the cost, I would still choose truth. Because God doesn't ask us to protect outcomes. He asks us to trust Him with them. This is what I've learned, that even now, in the world we live in today, reality can still be influenced, redirected, and guided by our Maker. God is not distant. He is not silent. He is deeply involved, deeply loving, and deeply faithful. What He asks of us is not perfection, but willingness, not certainty, but surrender. We only need to seek Him. As Jesus said, "But seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." Matthew 6:33. And I have found out that when we do, when we truly seek Him first, He is already there, going before us. As the story comes to a close, I want you to know you don't have to carry what's on your heart alone. If there's a prayer you're holding, big or small, spoken or unspoken, you're welcome to leave it in the comments. I read them and I pray over them. Sometimes naming what we're carrying is the first step toward peace. And if you feel led, if these stories and moments of reflection have helped you in any way, I invite you to join us by subscribing. It's one simple way to help share God's goodness and grace with others around the world who may be searching for hope, comfort, or courage, just like you. Wherever you are, may you rest knowing this: God sees you, He hears you, and He is near.